The woman known to history as Golda Meir was born Golda Mabovich on 3 May 1898 in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. Moshe Mabovich, her father, was the progeny of a Russian army soldier who attended a renowned religious academy in Slonim, western Belarus, but ultimately pursued a trade as a carpenter. Blum Nidich was her mother, and the couple produced a total of 8 children, of which 3 females reached adulthood. Shayna, the eldest surviving daughter, was born in the year 1889. 9 years later, in 1898, Golda was born, and in 1902, Sipke, also known as Clara, the youngest daughter, was born. They were raised in Pinsk, Belarus, which is now considered Belarus, as members of the Pale of Settlement along the western frontier of the Russian Empire. Since the late 18th century, the Jewish population had been restricted to this area. Sipi, Golda's paternal grandmother, arrived in Kyiv shortly after her birth to assume responsibility for the household. This development led to a dispute between Blum and her mother regarding the proper upbringing of the children. Golda subsequently recounted that among her earliest recollections was scenes of her grandmother and mother engaged in an argument. Following the birth of Sipke, Golda's younger sibling, in 1902, Shayna, who was 12 years old at the time, assumed responsibility for her upbringing. Her upbringing was characterized by unhappiness, as she was impoverished and encircled by quarreling women from 3 distinct generations: her grandmother, mother, and older sister. Early in 1903, Golda and her Nidich grandparents returned to Pinsk, where Moshe Mabovich had relocated the family. A new surge of political violence against Jews emerged in the spring of 1903, instigated by an anti-Jewish riot or pogrom that occurred in April 1903 in Kishinev, the capital of contemporary Moldova. A few weeks later, Moshe fortified the entrance with wooden planks in anticipation of rumors of an impending pogrom in Pinsk, while the adolescent Shayna procured a kitchen knife for self-preservation. Sipke, Golda's infant sibling, and Izinka were taken upstairs to the care of their neighbors. Fear and apprehension that Golda, then 5 years old, encountered during the ordeal endured throughout her lifetime, despite the fact that the pogrom failed to materialize. Shortly thereafter, Moshe resolved to immigrate to the United States alongside tens of thousands of fellow Russian Jews, a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. He would depart alone, find employment, and save money in accordance with the custom at the time in order to transport the remainder of his family across the ocean. Shayna joined a group of politically engaged high school students who deliberated on potential measures that Jews could undertake to end the anti-Semitic discrimination they were confronted with, while her family awaited word from Moshe. A minuscule proportion of the Jewish population was captivated by Zionism, an ideology espoused by Theodor Herzl, a journalist hailing from Vienna, which advocated for the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. At the time, Palestine was under the governance of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which operated from its capital in Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul. After the Kishinev pogrom, Herzl corresponded with British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain regarding the possibility of establishing a provisional Jewish state in Uganda. However, this idea was not implemented. During this period, a significant number of Jews were enticed by the socialist and Marxist ideologies, which sought to unite the working class and overthrow the Russian monarchy led by Tsar Nicholas II in order to establish a new state devoid of discrimination and prejudice. Despite the animosity between the working classes and the Jews stemming from the involvement of Jewish financiers, a significant number of socialist leaders identified as Jews. Shayna and her group, which advocated for socialism and Zionism, significantly impacted Golda's political development. Blum feared that the family might be singled out by the Tsarist state due to Shayna's political activities. However, the adolescent disobeyed her mother and continued to attend political meetings despite her concerns. Shayna was additionally tasked with instructing her sister in fundamental arithmetic and reading and writing. Since Herzl's death at the age of 44 in 1904, Shayna has mourned for more than 2 years while dressed in black. Subsequent to his initial arrival in New York, Moshe Mabovich relocated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he secured employment with the railroad under the alias Morris. He had achieved the financial means to dispatch his spouse and daughters by 1906. Golda accompanied her sisters and mother as they fled Russia via falsified documents, first arriving in Vienna and then proceeding to Antwerp, Belgium, where they boarded a steamer across the Atlantic. The family continued their journey by train from Quebec, where they had arrived 2 weeks prior, to Milwaukee, in June 1906. Golda Mabovich, then 8 years old, was not nostalgic for Eastern Europe. In fact, she would spend the next 15 years of her life in the United States, where she would develop much more cherished recollections. Bloom, accompanied by Shana, established a grocery store in Milwaukee within days of their arrival, doing so while their 2 younger daughters attended school. Golda Meir attended the 4th Street School, which is now recognized as the Golda Meir School in honor of its most renowned graduate, from 1906 to 1912. While Golda was content to be a part of the Jewish community in Milwaukee without the threat of persecution during the pogroms, Shana resented working alongside her mother and fled momentarily to Chicago to find employment at a clothing factory. In contrast, Golda was enthusiastic about her studies and quickly ascended to the top of her class. Additionally, she was garnering acclaim beyond the educational sphere. In 1909, at the tender age of 11, she and her closest friend Regina Hamburger established the American Young Sisters Society with the purpose of soliciting funds for textbooks intended for their less privileged peers. Being the sole English proficient member of her family, she assisted newly arrived Jewish immigrants in securing employment and motivated them to become members of labor unions. The Mabovich residence served as a venue for gatherings of the Workers of Zion, a labor Zionist organization that amalgamated socialist and Zionist principles, and the local branch of Pole Zion. Due to the fact that both her father and sister were members, Golda, then 14 years old, voluntarily joined the organization in 1912. Despite receiving valedictorian honors from her elementary school in 1912, Golda was advised by her traditional parents to remain at home and await matrimony to a prosperous man. Golda, motivated by her sister's support, resolved to pursue further education and matriculated into North Division High School during the autumn term. Shana, who had relocated to Denver at this juncture in order to recuperate from a case of tuberculosis, entered into matrimony with Shammai Korngold, a longtime acquaintance hailing from Pinsk. Bloom informed Golda that she had discovered her ideal spouse, a 30-year-old real estate professional named Mr. Goodstein, within months of her freshman year of high school. A distraught Golda, abhorred at the thought of matrimonially uniting with a man twice her age, corresponded with the Korngolds, who extended an invitation for her to reside with them in Denver. Golda, assisted by her companion Regina, managed to escape her parents' residence in February 1913 and proceeded to Denver via the train. She attended Northside High School and spent her evenings with members of the local Jewish community discussing politics at the Korngolds' residence. At social gatherings, Shana criticized Golda for being overly cordial with the males and advised her to focus on her studies. Tensions between the two sisters escalated as a result of Golda's refusal, which persisted until 1914, when she made the decision to vacate the Korngolds' residence and begin working in a department store while renting a modest flat. During this period, she initiated a romantic relationship with Morris Meyerson, a 21-year-old socialist activist and sign painter who ignited her passion for lyricism and music. Golda's parents requested in a letter to her the following year that she return home to finish her education. In 1916, she graduated from North Division after agreeing to do so, whereas Morris continued to reside in Denver and corresponded with her on a weekly basis via correspondence. Throughout the First World War, Golda maintained a keen interest in European affairs from Milwaukee. Millions of Jews from the Pale were displaced on the Eastern Front as a result of the conflict between the Russian Empire and the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Golda assisted her father in obtaining funds to assist Jewish refugees. Her membership in the executive committee of her local Pole Zion branch bolstered her conviction regarding Zionism and stimulated her aspiration to relocate to Palestine. Golda was reunited with Meyerson in Milwaukee by 1916, after he had relocated to be with her. His hopes were to establish an existence in the United States, not Palestine, as Golda did. Following Golda's ultimatum that he not wed him unless he consented to accompany her to Palestine, Morris ultimately acquiesced. The union took place on December 24, 1917. The cancellation of transatlantic shipping in January 1917, subsequent to Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which led to the United States aligning itself with Britain, France, and a disintegrating Russia in the First World War, prevented the newlywed couple from embarking on a journey to Palestine. Golda harbored a positive outlook regarding the Zionist cause subsequent to the November 1917 proclamation by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour endorsing the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, which would safeguard the rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants in the area. Golda worked as a librarian at the local library, but devoted the majority of her time to political activism for Pole Zion. The American Jewish Congress was founded in November 1918, following the conclusion of the First World War, with the objective of establishing a unified stance of American Jews prior to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Golda was elected to the organization and, along with her fellow Zionists, demanded that Palestine be ceded to Britain so that it could implement the Balfour Declaration in accordance with a mandate from the newly formed League of Nations. Following the conclusion of the Congress meeting, Golda received an invitation from the National Pole Zion organization to embark on a nationwide fundraising tour. In defiance of the desires expressed by her spouse, parents, and sister Shana, she wholeheartedly embraced the offer and made only intermittent visits back to Milwaukee. The British government was ultimately granted the mandate for Palestine, much to the delight of the Zionists. Golda and Morris were eventually able to embark on the journey in the summer of 1921. In addition to Regina Hamburger, a childhood companion of Golda's, Shana and Shammai Korngold accompanied their 2 children as members of a group of 17 Jewish pioneers. They arrived in Tel Aviv, the Jewish settlement established in 1909 in close proximity to the port of Jaffa, on July 14, 1921. Tel Aviv, in stark contrast to the depiction of Palestine that Golda had presented to her American audiences, was a dilapidated slum situated in an arid desert. 10 miles away, in the ancient city of Lod, Morris quickly secured a position as a bookkeeper, while Golda began instructing English. With the intention of establishing a kibbutz, a communal agricultural enterprise for Jews, Golda submitted an application to the kibbutz Mehavia, situated in the northern region of the Jezreel Valley. The kibbutz members rejected the Meyerson's application twice. However, Golda's perseverance secured him admission for a probationary period with a 3rd vote. Golda enthusiastically participated in communal dinners in an effort to prove to her fellow kibbutzniks that she possessed the same capacity for agricultural labor as anyone else. In contrast, Morris preferred to be alone with his gramophone. Nevertheless, both individuals were granted permanent admission to the kibbutz. Golda, on behalf of Mehavia, attended a kibbutz movement conference at the end of 1921. She was joined by notable politicians such as David Ben-Gurion, the Secretary General of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor, and the leader of the Workers' Party Ardut Ha-Avoda or Unity of Labor. Levi Eshkol, the leader of the Degania Bet Kibbutz, and Burl Katznelson, the intellectual originator of the labor Zionist movement, were 2 additional influential figures. Golda faced criticism during her conference address due to the fact that she spoke in her native Yiddish language instead of Hebrew. Upon her return to Mehavia, she learned that Morris, her spouse, was afflicted with malaria and depression. However, she maintained her dedication to her political responsibilities and was elected to the Women Workers' Council to represent her kibbutz. Golda, in her capacity as a council representative at the Second Histadrut Conference in 1923, put forth the proposition that women could be integrated into the Histadrut leadership, thereby obviating the necessity for an independent women's council. This idea garnered the interest of Ben-Gurion and Katznelson. Morris and his spouse departed the kibbutz in 1924, subsequently relocating to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Although Golda was mesmerized by the historical and cultural aspects of Jerusalem, Morris opted to preserve her affiliations with the Zionist political hub located in Tel Aviv. Golda was the proud mother of a son who was named Menahem in honor of her maternal grandfather, on November 23, 1924. The couple was employed by Solol Bonnet, a Histadrut-affiliated building cooperative. However, the organization encountered financial challenges and remunerated workers with vouchers that were not widely accepted in retail establishments. Golda, carrying 6-month-old Menahem, made a fleeting return to Mohavia in 1925. However, instead of granting her permission to assist on the farm, the kibbutz members requested her services as a nanny. This denial prompted Golda to return to Jerusalem. Following the May 1926 birth of her daughter Sarah, Golda overcame her pride and began instructing English at a private school. Golda's parents relocated to Palestine in the same year and constructed a residence in Herzliya, located to the north of Tel Aviv. Despite making regular visits to her parents and sister, Golda continued to experience discontentment and developed a sense of estrangement from her spouse. There were rumors that she was romantically involved with other men, including David Remez, Burl Katznelson's protege and the head of Solol Bonnet. Regarding the Women's Worker Council, Remez extended an offer of Secretary General in 1927 with the intention of consolidating Histadrut's authority over the organization. Golda returned to Tel Aviv with her 2 children after accepting the role. She had left her husband in Jerusalem. Golda, who had entrusted the care of the children to the kindergarten and babysitters, utilized her Women's Council membership to engage in the deliberations at the Histadrut. As the vehicle for the establishment of the new Jewish state, the organization facilitated Golda's prompt request to return to the United States for fundraising excursions advocating for Jewish immigration to Palestine. Her upbringing in the United States ensured a warm reception, and the Histadrut leadership, appreciative of her endeavors, dispatched her to Western Europe with the objective of garnering support from socialist organizations in Britain and France. Upon the merger of the 2 major socialist parties in Palestine, Golda observed the formation of MAPI, the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, upon her return to Palestine. To revitalize the labor Zionist movement and obtain medical treatment for her daughter's kidney disease, Golda traveled to the United States in 1932. Golda spent the following 2 years touring North America in support of the Zionist cause, using biblical language to describe the exploits of the pioneers who emigrated to Palestine. Her hectic schedule prevented her from spending much time with her children, who grew weary of her extended absences. Upon her return to Palestine in 1934, Golda was given the responsibility of overseeing the tourism sector as a member of the Executive Council of Histadrut. Despite notable advancements in attracting Jewish settlers to Ben Gurion and the subsequent increase in Tel Aviv's population to 150,000, the influx of Jewish immigrants instigated rioting among the pre-existing majority Arab populace. Quotas were established by the British authorities in Palestine in response to the demonstrations. They aimed to restrict the number of Jews relocating to Palestine. Arabs and Jews alike inevitably found these quotas to be excessively high or low, respectively. Simultaneously, Palestine received a steady influx of Jewish emigrants from Germany following the 1933 rise to power of Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitic Nazi Party. Golda continued her travels as the international representative of Histadrut. During this time, she fulfilled the Jewish Agency's directives regarding the provision of housing and employment for these immigrants. The Jewish Agency functioned as the de facto Jewish government in Palestine. In 1936, in response to a fresh surge of political strife between Arabs and Jews, the British government appointed Lord William Peel to preside over an inquiry commission tasked with formulating a resolution to the Palestine dispute. Following consultations with Jewish and Arab leaders, The Peel Commission arrived at the conclusion that partitioning Palestine into an independent Jewish state while annexing the majority of the territory to the Arab Kingdom of Transjordan to the east was the most viable solution. Ben-Gurion was ecstatic about the possibility of an independent Jewish state, whereas Golda vehemently opposed the partition recommendations of the Peel Commission, which allocated only a quarter of historical Palestine to the Jews. Golda mobilized opposition to the Peel Commission's proposals at the 20th Zionist Congress in Zurich, Switzerland, in 1937, by convening right-wing Zionists who were adamant about avoiding concessions to the Arabs and Jewish socialists who advocated for a unified Palestine in which Jews and Arabs coexisted. Congress supported Golda's stance, and the Second British Commission, which issued its report in 1938, was opposed to partition. Concurrently, the predicament faced by European Jews deteriorated subsequent to Hitler's annexation of Austria and the 1938 threats to incorporate Czechoslovakia into the Third Reich of the Nazis. Golda attempted to convince British authorities to raise the immigration quota, which had been reduced to slightly over 10,000 in 1937, while simultaneously functioning as an agent for the Mossad Aliyah Bet, an illicit organization responsible for the unauthorized removal of Jews from Europe during the Nazi era. Amidst the predicament encountered by European Jews, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt convened the Evian Conference in the summer of 1938. Representatives from 32 countries gathered to deliberate on the matter. Golda, in her capacity as an observer advocating for the Jewish people of Palestine, was indignant at the recurrent displays of compassion towards the Jews, coupled with the substantial refusal to accommodate refugees. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of the United Kingdom unveiled his concluding strategy for Palestine in May 1939. This plan imposed limitations on Jewish migration to 75,000 over the subsequent 5 years and restricted the Jewish population to 5% of Palestinian territory. Within a span of 10 years, a Palestinian state would emerge that was autonomous and governed in a dual-faith manner. As a result of the betrayal felt by the Jews in Palestine, Golda joined Ben-Gurion and Katznelson in conducting a general strike that involved nearly 200,000 Jews. Simultaneously, the Jewish community in Palestine established Jewish settlements throughout the country in preparation for conflict against the Arabs and the British. During the 21st Zionist Congress in Vienna in August 1939, the aforementioned plans were nearing completion. Concurrently, representatives of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the communist state that dominated a significant portion of the former Russian Empire, inked a non-aggression pact. Hitler's invasion of Poland, a nation with 4 million Jews, on September 1 precipitated the Second World War, which was initiated by the declaration of war by Britain and France against Germany. Golda and her colleagues encountered the unsettling circumstance of promoting Jewish enlistment in the British Army in anticipation of a potential German invasion, all the while engaging in the clandestine passage of Jewish refugees into Palestine. In her capacity as a prominent figure in the Jewish community, she participated in the British War Economic Advisory Council, which assisted in the implementation of rationing restrictions for the Jewish population during the war. Additionally, she oversaw the political department at Histadrut, which was tasked with the resolution of labor disputes. Hitler's armies were advancing through Europe at the same time that the British attempted to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. They had occupied significant portions of Belarus and Ukraine and forced the surrender of France in 1940 before launching an invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. German and Italian forces in North Africa issued a threat to attack Egypt and Palestine during the summer of 1942. Golda was among the select group of Jewish leaders in Palestine who held the belief in the allegations that the Germans were transporting Polish Jews to concentration camps and executing them in gas ovens when the information spread in 1942. Her objective was to secure financial resources for Jews under Nazi occupation to resist. Additionally, she extended an offer for the assistance of British covert agents operating behind enemy lines on behalf of the Haganah, a Zionist paramilitary organization, following the April 1943 uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. Palestine was no longer threatened with German invasion after the Second Battle of El Alamein, which was won by General Bernard Montgomery and involved Italian and German forces, in the autumn of 1942. However, the conflict in Europe persisted until the Nazi surrender in May 1945. Following the liberation of more than 600,000 Jews from concentration camps throughout Europe by the Allies, Golda and her companions endeavored to establish a refuge for them in Palestine. The Zionists were inspired by the July 1945 election triumph of the British Labour Party, which had consistently advocated for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The Jews once more felt betrayed when Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin attempted to maintain the policy of their conservative predecessors in Palestine. Haganah membership in two right-wing guerrilla organizations of the Jewish resistance movement was to Golda's dismay. However, following Bevin's policy announcement, Golda endorsed violent resistance, which ignited a civil war between Jewish fighters and British authorities. The United States government exhibited considerably greater benevolence towards the Zionists, and in early 1946, the British consented to the formation of an Anglo-American commission subsequent to American intervention. Golda delivered a speech to the commission on March 25, 1946, wherein she recounted the persecution and terror that Jews had encountered in Europe prior to Hitler's rise to power. She argued that establishing an independent Jewish life in a Jewish homeland was the only solution to the senselessness of Jewish life and Jewish death. On May 1, 1946, the Commission endorsed the continuation of the British mandate in Palestine and demanded that the British authorize 100,000 visas for Jews. As a result of the British government's denial of the visas, the Palestinian conflict began to escalate. In June 1946, following a British crackdown on the Jewish Agency's leadership, Golda was appointed director of the organization's political department. Amid her internal conflict regarding her abhorrence towards terrorist operations and her resolve to oppose the British occupation of Palestine, the Attlee administration shifted course in February 1947 and referred the Palestinian issue to the United Nations. September marked the introduction of a partition proposal by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which put the city of Jerusalem under international jurisdiction. The proposal stipulated that the Arabs would be allotted 43% of the Palestinian territory, while the Jews would receive 56%. A significant portion of this land was designated for the uninhabited Negev desert. The majority of Palestine's Arab neighbors, with the possible exception of King Abdullah of Transjordan, who aspired to Arab world leadership and was willing to support a Jewish state in exchange for Jewish support of Jordanian annexation of Arab Palestine, rejected the United Nations plan. In November 1947, when the Jordanian monarch put forth the idea of clandestine negotiations with the Palestinian Jews, he was taken aback by the Jewish delegation's female representative, Golda Meir. Abdullah aspired to completely annex Palestine prior to the establishment of an independent Jewish state. Golda was content to learn that he had no intention of uniting with his fellow Arab leaders in a military resistance against a Jewish state. During the United Nations General Assembly's late November session, Golda maintained her position in Palestine while her colleagues were in New York. On November 29, the Assembly adopted a resolution that endorsed the partition plan by a vote of 33 in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. As the Palestinian Jewish population celebrated their triumph, Arab guerrilla fighters initiated assaults on Jewish settlements. Golda assumed the responsibility of safeguarding the city of Jerusalem and subjected herself to peril by traversing hostile Arab-occupied territory en route to and from Tel Aviv on a regular basis. Golda returned to the United States in January 1948 to direct a fundraising effort for the acquisition of munitions for the Haganah. By leveraging the 6 million Jewish lives lost to the Nazis during the Holocaust as an analogy, she convinced affluent Jewish merchants to donate to the cause, amassing $15 million by the start of February. She had raised more than $50 million by the time she returned to Jerusalem in March, which enabled Ben-Gurion to command a counteroffensive in April that ultimately resulted in the cessation of the Haganah's siege of Jerusalem. Golda was disheartened that she was not selected for the newly established Jewish National Administration in March. However, she engaged in a second encounter with King Abdullah on May 10, this time in his capital city of Amman. Despite the king's apparent determination to abstain from involvement in the conflict, Golda found his recommendation that the Jews postpone complete independence for a few years to be frustrating. In anticipation of the British mandate expiring the following day, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the formation of the State of Israel in Tel Aviv on May 14, 1948. The National Council, comprising 37 members of the Israeli parliament, affixed its seal to the proclamation of independence. One of the individuals recognized was Golda Meir, who had just surpassed the age of 50. She had accumulated 27 years of experience in Palestine, during which she assiduously ascended the echelons of Jewish political organizations and became a close ally of Ben-Gurion. Despite not holding an official position in Ben-Gurion's cabinet, she actively participated in meetings and exerted her opinion. She returned to the United States shortly after the proclamation of Israeli statehood and raised an additional $75 million for the cause. Despite sustaining injuries in an automobile accident in New York, Golda was subsequently requested to serve as the Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union in Moscow. The Soviet Union and the United States had previously formed an alliance against Germany during World War II. However, by the late 1940s, this alliance had dissolved, giving rise to the Cold War. This ideological conflict aimed to establish dominance for American capitalism over Soviet communism on a global scale. Arms were supplied by the Soviet Union to the Israeli Defense Forces, the designated successor to the Haganah, in support of Israeli statehood. Golda initiated discussions with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov regarding trade and economic aid to Israel in September 1948, following the presentation of her credentials. However, due to the severe economic damage caused by the Soviet Union during the war, the Soviets were hesitant to make significant commitments in this regard. Stalin believed that Israel would function as an American satellite. Moreover, the primary motivation for Soviet support for Israeli statehood was the desire to expel the British from the Middle East. As she labored to advance in Moscow, Golda lamented her absence from her homeland, where the Israeli military had seized authority over northern Galilee and expelled the Egyptians from the southern Negev desert. At that point, the Arabs were compelled to concede defeat. Golda regarded it as her responsibility to communicate with the 3 million Jews residing in the Soviet Union from Moscow, the majority of whom desired to emigrate to Israel. It was difficult for her to do so until Polina Zhemchazina, the Jewish wife of Molotov, advised her to attend the synagogue in Moscow. Amid anticipation of Zhemchazina's apprehension and subsequent exile to Kazakhstan, Golda attended the synagogue in January 1949 to observe Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. There, tens of thousands of Jews applauded her as an act of solidarity with Israel. Stalin began to repress the Jewish population within weeks, and Golda was recalled to Israel in February to serve as the labor minister. Golda returned to Israel in March to assume the role of Minister of Labor, where she was tasked with the provision of housing and employment for the tens of thousands of Jews who were entering the country. She declared her intention to construct 30,000 new houses in the Knesset, the newly formed parliament, and pledged to obtain the necessary funds in the United States. Notwithstanding requests for financial support for the Israeli military and social welfare, the American Jews consented to fund the construction endeavor through the purchase of government-backed bonds. She proposed an ambitious infrastructure construction project upon her return to Israel in an effort to combat the unemployment rate. This project would include the repair of roads damaged in the recent conflict. She returned to the United States in 1950 with the intention of amassing $15 billion over the subsequent 15 years through government bonds. She persisted in advocating for Jewish immigration to Israel from her residence abroad, notwithstanding the strain on the pre-existing infrastructure of the state. In May 1951, Amidst her efforts to foster economic growth in Israel, Golda was devastated to learn that her husband, Morris, had succumbed to a myocardial infarction. David Remes, her political mentor and closest confidant, passed away weeks later. Golda, putting aside these private catastrophes, labored 28 hours per day in an effort to establish a social democratic state in Israel. She introduced a national insurance program in January 1952 with the intention of furnishing financial assistance to the elderly, children, and women. The Minister of Labor triumphed notwithstanding opposition from the Minister of Finance, Levi Eshkol. She introduced national service for women in hospitals and institutions through the successful passage of a bill in 1953. However, this action incited discontent within the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. In 1955, Golda was unsuccessful in running for mayor of Tel Aviv as Mapai's candidate after two reactionary Orthodox representatives voted in favor of the incumbent, despite Ben-Gurion's invitation. Despite the implementation of an armistice mediated by the United Nations since July 1949, Arab insurgents, also known as Fedayeen, persisted in their offensive activities against Israeli territory. Moshe Dayan, the belligerent chief of operations of the Israeli Defense Forces, dispatched a force of crack troops led by Ariel Sharon to initiate a retaliatory attack against the Fedayeen base of Kibbutz in Jordan in October 1953. Infuriated by the constant incursions, the operation resulted in the deaths of 69 civilians. A sequence of disagreements ensued between Ben-Gurion and his foreign minister, Moshe Sharet, in response to the incident. Sharet condemned the Israeli Defense Forces' disproportionate use of force. Ben-Gurion relinquished his premiership in January 1954 and was succeeded by Sharet amidst the power struggle. However, by late 1955, he had reclaimed the position and endeavored to solidify his position of authority. Shortly after assuming the Hebrew appellation Meir in June 1956, Golda assumed the position of Israel's representative on the international stage at the Foreign Ministry, succeeding Sharet. Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal in July 1956, thereby endangering the economic interests of Great Britain and France. Ben-Gurion accepted the British and French invitation to participate in a military operation to secure the canal. He harbored resentment towards Nasser for impeding Israeli shipping through the canal and permitting Palestinian Fedayeen to attack Israel from Egyptian territory. Although Meir participated in the discussions, the majority of the discourse was conducted by Moshe Dayan and Shimon Peres of the Ministry of Defense. A scheme was formulated by the three involved parties whereby Britain and France would intervene under the guise of peacekeepers while carrying out their actual objectives of occupying the canal, while Israel would initiate an invasion of Egypt. In 4 days after the operation commenced on October 29, 1956, Israeli forces had seized control of the entire Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip east of the canal. Despite suffering severe losses, Nasser achieved global sympathy and rendered the canal impassable through shipwrecks. At the United Nations, both the Soviet Union and the United States implored Israeli forces to withdraw. At the United Nations, Israel was represented by Foreign Minister Golda Meir, who argued that Israel's occupation of the Sinai Peninsula was a defensive measure in response to repeated attacks by Fedayeen from Egyptian bases. Ben-Gurion, yielding to diplomatic pressure emanating from the United States, consented to the withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for U.S. acknowledgement of Israel's legitimate response to additional Fedayeen assaults emanating from Egypt. Meir grudgingly addressed the United Nations on this subject, but was dismayed when the United States refused to recognize Israel's right to retaliate. After the Suez Crisis, Meir and Ben-Gurion harbored divergent perspectives regarding the most effective course of action with regard to West Germany. Ben-Gurion endeavored to secure military and economic assistance from the Germans, whereas Meir harbored reservations regarding collaborating with a government that maintained a significant number of former Nazi officials. As Germany progressively emerged as the second largest provider of armament to Israel, Meir endorsed Ben-Gurion's approach of cultivating stronger relations with Germany. In fact, she consented to the designation of former Nazi officer Ralph Friedman Pauls as the German ambassador to Israel in 1965. Mossad, the National Security Agency of Israel, kidnapped Adolf Eichmann, a high-ranking Nazi official, from Argentina in May 1960. Eichmann had escaped Argentina in 1945 subsequent to his conviction for war crimes. In response to Argentina's complaint to the United Nations that Israel had infringed on its sovereignty, Meir vehemently defended Israeli actions, asserting that the unlawful incursion was warranted to apprehend the perpetrators of the Holocaust. Her position was supported by the United Nations, and in June 1962, Eichmann was judged and executed in Israel. Meir devoted the majority of her foreign ministerial term to fostering relations with newly independent sub-Saharan African states. Although Meir perceived black Africans as inherent allies in the fight against ethnic discrimination and colonialism, the African states welcomed the chance to receive economic aid from a nation that had not participated in the process of continent partition. Meir assisted Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah in establishing a state-owned shipping company, oversaw a public works program in Nigeria on behalf of Israeli construction firms, and supplied Israeli army physicians to fill the physician shortage in the Congo following the Belgian withdrawal in 1962. Although Ben-Gurion harbored skepticism regarding the endeavors of his foreign minister in Africa, Meir rationalized her undertakings as a strategy to counterbalance the influence of the Arab world in the area. Meir was additionally intrigued by Africa due to his perception that Ben-Gurion utilized diplomacy primarily for the purpose of acquiring weaponry and relied on defense ministry officials, which he himself oversaw, to direct his dealings with the world's foremost powers. Meir not only regarded individuals such as Dayan and Peres as unnecessarily belligerent, but also harbored concerns that they might stray from the prevailing labor Zionist ideology. In opposition to Ben-Gurion's late 1950s plan to promote Dayan and Peres to the cabinet, Meir, along with two seasoned Mapai leaders, Minister of Education Zalman Aran and Minister of Trade Pinhas Sapir, exhibited resistance. Ben-Gurion and the Old Guard, under the leadership of Meir, engaged in a protracted and arduous conflict in the initial half of the 1960s. Ben-Gurion endeavored to initiate a public inquiry into the actions of Pinhas Lavin, the defense minister between 1954 and 1955. Lavin, who was accused of authorizing a false flag operation to bomb civilian targets in Egypt, denied any involvement and placed the responsibility on Peres. After resigning under duress, Lavin endeavored to clear his identity. When Ben-Gurion put forth the idea of conducting a comprehensive judicial inquiry, Meir and the majority of the Mapai leaders rose in opposition, abhorred by the notion of a public leadership struggle. Levi Eshkol succeeded Ben-Gurion as premier in June 1963, following which Ben-Gurion reiterated his demand for a public inquiry into the Lavin affair, while simultaneously criticizing his successor. Meir spearheaded the effort to thwart Ben-Gurion's political resurgence, notwithstanding her recent lymphoma diagnosis and mid-60s personal condition. In February 1965, Meir leaned over and caressed Ben-Gurion as a dying Moshe Sharett criticized the former prime minister for undermining national unity in the Knesset. Meir then launched her own assault against the prime minister. In November, Ben-Gurion responded by establishing the Rafi Party, which secured 10 seats in the Knesset elections. During this period, Meir successfully coordinated an alliance with Adat Ha-Avoda, the pro-Soviet faction that had separated from Mapai in 1944. This alliance ultimately secured 45 seats and sealed the political demise of Ben-Gurion. After attaining political triumph, Meir submitted her resignation as foreign minister in January 1966, citing illness as the reason for her decision to retire. She maintained significant political influence and was promptly extended an invitation to assume the position of Secretary General of Mapai. She gladly acquiesced to this duty with the intention of promoting the amalgamation of the moderate socialist parties into a unified Labour Party. While Eshkol nominally held the position of prime minister, Meir wielded the greatest political influence within the nation. As the Israeli government endeavored to recuperate from the detrimental political turmoil of the preceding decade, tensions along the Egyptian-Israeli border escalated. On May 16, 1967, in light of inaccurate Soviet intelligence indicating an impending Israeli assault, NASA issued a request for the United Nations peacekeeping force stationed along the Egyptian-Israeli frontier, which had been deployed since the Suez Crisis. His intention was to have the force's members substituted with Egyptian soldiers. In contrast to Eshkol's administration, which struggled to manage the crisis, Menahem Begin, the leader of the conservative opposition, banded together with Dayan in support of Ben-Gurion leading a government of national unity. Despite their opposition, Eshkol and Meir were compelled to concede to a national unity government led by Dayan as the Minister of Defense. Dayan issued an aerial directive for the Israeli Air Force on the morning of June 5. In less than an hour, in excess of 300 Egyptian aircraft were annihilated by ground forces. During a span of 6 days, Israeli forces successfully re-established control over the Golan Heights from Egypt's ally Syria, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Gaza Strip. Additionally, they captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan. The Israelis were this time resolved to resist United Nations demands that they withdraw their occupation forces. Meir persisted in her endeavors to consolidate the moderate left upon her return to Israel. Her efforts culminated in January 1968, when the Israeli Labour Party was formed through the merger of Mapai, Rafi, and Ardut. Meir resigned from his position as the United Progressive Party's first General Secretary in August 1968, ostensibly with the intention of retiring permanently. To impede Dayan's aspirations to succeed Eshkol, Meir appointed former Ardut leader Yigal Allon to the position of Deputy Prime Minister. Late in 1968, while Allon and Dayan were disputing in the background about the West Bank's future, Eshkol suffered a heart attack and passed away at the end of February 1969. In light of the potential party schism that could result from the appointment of either Allon or Dayan as Prime Minister, Labour Secretary General Pinhas Sapir extended an invitation to Meir to assume the position. She reluctantly agreed, acknowledging her deteriorating health, until her physician provided reassurance that she still had 10 years to live. Despite Dayan and Allon enjoying considerably greater public support, the Central Committee of the Labour Party unanimously voted in favour of Meir on March 7. Meir subsequently ascended the premiership on March 17. The individual in question, who had supported Ben-Gurion from the 1950s until his political demise in the 1960s and was now 2 months shy of her 71st birthday, had achieved the historic feat of becoming the first female chief of government in the Western Hemisphere. Golda Meir inherited an Israel that was diametrically opposed to the socialist agrarian utopia she had envisioned during her youth in Milwaukee. Despite this, she could take delight in her contribution to the establishment of a homeland for the Jews. Nevertheless, it remained vulnerable to assaults from hostile neighbors. After suffering an ignominious defeat in the Six-Day War in 1968, NASA initiated the war of attrition by launching missiles into Israeli-occupied Sinai from the western bank of the Suez Canal. Meir inherited Eshkol's coalition as prime minister, an alliance that encompassed the political spectrum and precipitated political impasse. Her approval rating surged to 90% in July due to her modesty and down-to-earth demeanor. In October 1969, she spearheaded an alliance comprising the Labour Party and the left-leaning Mapam Party, which secured her a total of 56 Knesset seats. Notwithstanding her inclination towards socialism, she encountered considerable difficulty in effectively addressing the labor disputes that engulfed the nation. Despite a 35% expansion in the Israeli economy between 1969 and 1973, wages failed to maintain pace with inflation, and the government controlled all labor unions in the country via Histradut. The Histradut were denied any form of autonomy from the state by Meir, and the Labor Federation came to an end within a span of 10 years. Her allegiance to socialist ideals of collectivism eroded her support among the younger segment of society that favored liberalism and individualism. Meir encountered a widespread uprising in Jerusalem in March 1971, which was orchestrated by the Black Panthers, an organization bearing the name of the renowned American civil rights organization, in opposition to prejudice against Jews of North African and Middle Eastern descent, whose living conditions were inferior to those of Eastern European descent. Eastern European Jews' preponderance in the Israeli government infuriated the Panthers, and Meir had previously stated that Jews who did not speak Yiddish were not authentic Jews. Meir attempted to defend Eastern European Jews during his crackdown on the Panthers by asserting that they had endured greater discrimination and deprivation than other Jews and by labeling the Panthers treasonous. Throughout the summer, protests persisted, and the Panthers torched Meir's effigy while demanding her resignation. Meir, who had previously opposed Ben-Gurion on the same point, now argued that the government could not afford social improvements and that defense expenditure should take precedence. Meir was concerned for Israel's continued existence despite the Israeli military's track record of triumphs, particularly in light of the Palestinian Liberation Organization's leader Yasser Arafat's declaration that the Arabs intended to destroy the State of Israel. Arafat had replaced Nasser as leader of the Arab cause in 1970. Meir made concerted efforts to engage in diplomatic negotiations with her Arab counterparts. However, their cooperation was conditioned on the Israelis returning to their borders prior to 1967. Meir, as expected, declined to surrender her bargaining power prior to the commencement of negotiations. The Soviet Union and the United States, disillusioned with the United Nations peace process, attempted to devise a solution for the Middle East. Both major powers aimed to prevent the Cold War from intensifying, and U.S. President Richard Nixon harbored a strong desire to foster better relations with the Soviet Union. Meir maintained the view that efficacy was limited for peace initiatives of this nature, given the Arabs' unwavering resolve to eradicate Israel from global prominence. President William Rogers of Nixon's administration unveiled a peace strategy in December 1969. The plan called for an Israeli withdrawal from all occupied territories in exchange for an Egyptian commitment to non-belligerency. Meir, sensing the ambiguity of Rogers' proposals, directed Yitzhak Rabin, her ambassador to Washington, to galvanize the American Jewish lobby against the proposition. Bombing assaults into the Egyptian interior accompanied the Israeli refusal, prompting the Soviets to augment their arms supplies to Egypt. Meir reluctantly agreed to Rogers' offer of a 90-day ceasefire in conjunction with United Nations mediation at the end of July 1970. However, her confidence in the Americans was eroded when Israeli intelligence revealed that Nasser had utilized the ceasefire to install a Soviet anti-aircraft missile system on the western bank of the Suez Canal. When compelled to exhibit more adaptability, the Israeli Prime Minister frequently recalled the apprehension she felt during her childhood when pogroms threatened the Russian Empire. She specifically accused the United States of jeopardizing Jewish security for diplomatic purposes. She grew closer to Moshe Dayan, her former adversary and current defense minister, as she adopted her defiant stance. The Prime Minister conceded her lack of knowledge regarding military affairs and sought counsel from the well-liked general, whereas the defense minister held Israel's matriarchal political acumen in high regard. The September 1970 demise of Nasser sparked optimism regarding the possibility of a peace accord with his successor, Anwar Sadat. Meir proposed a partial withdrawal from the eastern bank of the Suez Canal, whereas Sadat insisted that Israel evacuate entirely from the occupied territories. Meir devised a strategy in which Israel would retain the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, and the Egyptian port of Sharm el-Sheikh at the southernmost point of the Sinai, while withdrawing its forces from the remainder of the peninsula, despite the fact that Sadat's counteroffer was rejected. Menahem Begin initiated a vote of no confidence against her in response to the propositions, which she narrowly survived. Meir harbored more ambiguous intentions regarding the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. However, she was amenable to ceding these regions to the Arabs, preferably Jordan, on the grounds that a Jewish-majority state would be more advantageous for Israel's security than resettling over 1 million Arabs from the occupied territories. Meir, hesitant to disrupt the intricate political equilibrium of the region prior to the Arabs' genuine engagement in negotiations, preserved the existing state of affairs, delegating governance of the West Bank to Dayan and the Ministry of Defense. Dayan advocated for an unconventional resolution wherein Israel maintained a persistent military presence in the West Bank, while permitting Jordan to administer the Arab territories. Despite facing opposition from the majority of his government colleagues, Dayan began to implement his vision of establishing Jewish settlements in the West Bank and facilitating the movement of products and people between Israel and Jordan in the hope that coexistence would lead to peace. Notwithstanding their armed assistance to Egypt in 1967, the Jordanians maintained their staunchest allegiance to Israel among the Arab states. The Israelis acknowledged that King Hussein had been subjected to significant pressure from fellow Arab leaders and his own Palestinian subjects to exhibit pan-Arab solidarity. Hussein was similarly motivated to prevent the demise of his ancestor King Abdullah, an individual Meir had encountered prior to the establishment of Israel's independence. Abdullah had been murdered in 1951 by a Palestinian terrorist. 4 commercial aircraft were commandeered by Palestinian terrorists on September 6, 1970, and subsequently landed at Dawson's Field, an air station in Jordan, while demanding the release of Fedayeen prisoners. Following the liberation of the majority of the captives, the Palestinians detained the Jews and, on September 12, detonated the empty aircraft. On September 17, Hussein issued an order for loyal troops to suppress the Fedayeen in his capital city of Amman, precipitating a descent into civil war in Jordan. This action prompted Syrian intervention on behalf of the Palestinians. Meir, in response to Hussein's entreaty, issued an order for the Israeli Air Force to conduct a show of force over the Syrian columns. This action, in conjunction with a triumphant Jordanian counteroffensive, brought an end to the Syrian assault. Nasser mediated a provisional peace agreement between Palestine and Jordan days prior to his passing. Numerous parties, including a delegation of African leaders, Romania's communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and Pope Paul VI, offered to mediate a peace settlement as the impasse in the Middle East continued. Meir, who had given up hope of any meaningful peace with the Arabs, was further discouraged on September 5, 1972, when 11 Israeli athletes were abducted by the Palestinian terrorist organization Black September at the Munich Olympics. Following the deaths of 2 Israelis, the terrorists threatened to execute the remainder unless Israel released more than 200 Arab prisoners. The occurrence marked the most recent in a sequence of terrorist assaults directed at Israeli targets that were sanctioned by the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Arafat. The German police executed an unsuccessful rescue operation after the terrorists declined to comply with the ransom demand put forth by the West German authorities. As a consequence, all Israelis, a German police officer, and 5 terrorists perished. Meir, in retaliation, authorized Mossad to initiate an operation on September 15 to apprehend the terrorists accountable for the attacks in Munich. Meir defended the Palestinian Arabs' right to reside in any Arab state in the Middle East and denied the existence of a distinct Palestinian nation when criticized for depriving the Palestinians of their right to their own country. Meir, who had presided over the nation for 4 years, declared her intention to vacate the position of premier in October 1973. In May 1973, the fact that her approval ratings remained above 70%, the economy was expanding at a rapid rate, and the United States government was providing Israel with substantial military assistance contributed to her developing sense of security. In August, as Meir shifted her focus from defense to social policy, the Syrians erected Soviet anti-aircraft batteries in opposition to the Golan Heights. King Hussein visited Israel in secrecy on September 25 to warn of an impending Syrian assault backed by Egypt. Dayan held the belief that the Egyptians would not have the audacity to confront the Israeli military, notwithstanding Israeli intelligence reports indicating advance of Egyptian forces towards the Suez Canal. General David Elazar, Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, had reason to believe that hostilities were imminent on October 5. However, the Israeli leadership opted against conducting a comprehensive mobilization at that time. Meir convened a gathering with Elazar and Dayan in the early hours of October 6, the eve of Yom Kippur, the holy day according to the Jewish calendar. Despite her reluctance to initiate a preemptive airstrike that could potentially compromise diplomatic support from the United States, she consented to the complete mobilization despite Dayan's objections. The Israeli leadership was confident that they would replicate their previous victories against the Arabs when the invasion commenced that afternoon. The Egyptians coordinated assaults on Israeli targets along the canal in the south, while Syrian tanks advanced towards the Golan Heights, caught him off guard. The Israeli air superiority that had triumphed in the Six-Day War was rendered ineffectual by the anti-aircraft systems of Egypt and Syria. Elazar maintained his confidence in his ability to withstand enemy assaults long enough to mobilize his reserves, whereas a distraught Dayan advocated for a more secure bastion in lieu of the Golan. Meir declined Dayan's resignation and assumed personal responsibility for the war effort, collaborating with her senior commanders to devise strategies for a counteroffensive. The tide of war began to turn in the direction of the Israeli reserves, albeit at a high price of significant casualties. The Syrians were retreating in the north by the third day of the conflict, while Elazar's expensive counteroffensive in the south halted the Egyptian advance. Meir authorized the Israeli Defense Force to advance on the Syrian capital of Damascus on October 11, following the recapturing of the Golan Heights. An Egyptian assault in the Sinai was thwarted by Israeli tanks on October 14, enabling Israeli forces to traverse the canal on October 15. Meir was initially inclined to reject the ceasefire and direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel proposed by the Soviets and Americans, given that the Israeli Defense Force was positioned to encircle and eradicate the Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai. On October 22, Meir met with U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to finalize the terms of an armistice subsequent to learning that Sadat had accepted the proposals. Fighting resumed on the 25th of October, despite an Egyptian effort to escape the encirclement, until a second armistice was reached with the Egyptian Third Army completely ensnared. Despite the Israelites' eventual triumph, 2,600 soldiers were killed in the process. Instead of rejoicing, the Israeli populace attributed the initial setbacks to Meir and Dayan. Although she accepted culpability for the debacle, Meir traveled to the United States to meet with Kissinger and Nixon to discuss peace proposals. During late-night conversations with Kissinger, Meir unequivocally declined to assist in the Third Army's encirclement in the absence of a prisoner exchange. Meanwhile, on October 28, Egyptian and Israeli army officers achieved significant advancements in their negotiations regarding the resupply of the Egyptian Third Army, a prisoner exchange, the progressive withdrawal of troops from both sides, and the re-establishment of access to the Suez Canal. The agreement was formally concluded the week after Kissinger's visit to the Middle East. The Knesset elections that had been slated for the 31st of October had been rescheduled to the 31st of December due to the conflict. Notwithstanding her prior pledge to tender her resignation, Meir harbored aspirations for the unity of the Labour Party and the denial of authority to Begin's Likud party. While Dayan was held accountable for the inability to adequately prepare for the conflict, Meir maintained the position of defense minister, which resulted in a decline in her own popularity. Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, along with the Jordanian and Egyptian delegations, witnessed the Middle East Peace Conference in Geneva on December 21. However, the summit concluded after a single day without a reconvening motion. On the 31st, electors turned out in support of Meir's Labour, which secured 40% of the vote compared to Likud's 29%. Although Labour continued to be the largest political party, Meir was disheartened by the loss of support. Meir recognized that a faction of the Labour Party would refuse to support the government regardless of whether she retained or dismissed Dayan as she attempted to reconstruct it. She tendered her resignation as party leader on April 11, endorsing Yitzhak Rabin, who narrowly secured the party's nomination. Meir maintained her position as premier until May 31, when she successfully negotiated a disengagement agreement with Syria under the mediation of Henry Kissinger. She vacated the position of Prime Minister on June 3 and was succeeded by Rabin. During her lifetime, Golda Meir, who was 76 years old, was a living legend. 1975 saw the publication of her ghost-written autobiography, which immediately became a worldwide bestseller. Meir attended the Broadway premiere of Golda, a production by William Gibson, on November 14, 1977. However, she was profoundly dissatisfied with Anne Bancroft's rendition of the title role. She returned to Israel days later in order to meet Anwar Sadat, who was in the country subsequent to his proclamation of peace. In response to Meir's inquiry as to why he had not encountered her several years earlier, Egyptian President Sadat stated that the circumstances were not opportune. In May of that year, Menahem Begin emerged victorious against Labour in the Knesset elections, securing the position of Prime Minister. Meir was dismayed that the rehabilitated Dayan was being credited with establishing peace by the reactionary Begin, who had appointed him as his foreign minister. Begin, Sadat, and Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, negotiated the Camp David Accords in September 1978, which facilitated the Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. During the time that Begin and Sadat were in Oslo to receive the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize, Golda Meir, who was 80 years old, passed away on December 8, 1978 from lymphoma. Golda Meir had traversed 3 continents in the course of her extraordinary existence. She became an ardent supporter of the Labour Zionist movement during her formative years in the United States, where she was raised in abject poverty and the threat of pogroms in the Russian Empire. Succumbing to the challenge of reconciling her personal aspirations with the expectations of her parents, she managed to convince her averse spouse to relocate to Palestine in anticipation of the formation of a Jewish state subsequent to the Balfour Declaration. Meir began her ascent to the Jewish political leadership after an arduous first decade in the kibbutz and while struggling to make ends meet in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. In the process, she abandoned her husband and children and became an indispensable advocate for the Zionist movement in the United States. Following her ceaseless efforts to aid European Jews persecuted by the Nazis during the 1930s and 1940s, Meir became the right-hand woman of David Ben-Gurion, the progenitor of the State of Israel established in 1948. In the year that Israel managed to repel the Arab invasion, Meir played a crucial role in procuring financial resources to support the Israeli military's ongoing resistance efforts. Prior to being appointed foreign minister on the verge of the Suez Crisis, she advocated for ambitious housing, construction, and social welfare programs during her tenure as Minister of Labour in the early 1950s. During her nearly 10 years as foreign minister, she facilitated the uninterrupted provision of American military assistance to Africa while concurrently enhancing diplomatic ties with African nations. Meir, who overthrew Ben-Gurion in the mid-1960s, went on to unify the labor movement and exert influence in the background throughout the 1967 Six-Day War. Following the demise of Levi Eshkol, she was appointed Prime Minister in 1969. During her prime ministership, Meir endeavored to reach a peace accord with Nasser and Sadat for the majority of the time. However, she was unprepared when the Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, and despite orchestrating successful counteroffensives against Egypt and Syria, she struggled to manage its repercussions. The pivotal progress in the Middle East peace process was achieved by Begin and Sadat in the dying months of her in 1978. Nevertheless, the matter continues to be unresolved in the 21st century. What is your assessment of Golda Meir? Did she prove to be a formidable leader who exhibited that women could compete with men on the international political stage and ensure the State of Israel's continued existence? Or did her intransigence and lack of flexibility cause her to miss out on several opportunities to make peace with the Arabs? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.